One Question is brought to you by Turnkey Search, a top industry search firm since 1996. Daniel Libit of UNM Fishbowl joins me on One Question. Daniel, you and the website have certainly been in the news quite a bit lately, given your in-depth and interesting coverage of what's happening at the University of New Mexico. And you've done plenty of work both on the institutional side and, of course, on the athletic side. And as I noted kind of in lead-in to wanting to grab you for One Question, I don't want to talk as much about specifically the New Mexico situation, A, because you've covered it quite closely, and B, because I think there's probably more story to be told here in the future. But what I really want to focus on is your background, why New Mexico, what you intend to do with the framework of the industry or the framework of the business that you're setting up. And I think there are a number of people around college athletics watching this story pretty closely. Run us through it and kind of lead us into why New Mexico and why this project.
Sure. Well, Matt, I want to thank you for having me on the podcast. It's a delight. So my background is in political reporting. I have covered national politics for various publications over the last decade. I, like many people who get into journalism or reporting to begin with, my entree was through sports reporting. So I was an intern at a local newspaper in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where I grew up. And that was sort of my window into journalism. And when I graduated college, I sort of contemplated doing what a lot of people do, which was find a sports writing gig at a newspaper. And had been offered a job early in my career to cover Fresno State University for the Fresno Bee. And this, of course, is a paper that has repeatedly produced, maybe more years back than recently, but has repeatedly sort of been a launching ground for national college sports reporters, in large part because for a while, Jerry Tarkanian was the coach, and it just seemed like you would go there, the system was you would go there, you'd break a scandal from the Jerry Tarkanian Fresno State Bulldogs, and then you would use that to go somewhere else. And so Eric Prisbel, used that to get to the Washington Post, and Jeff Passan used that to get to Yahoo. And it was like the place where you go to, basically break an easy scandal because Tarkanian produced quite a few of them, and then get a job promotion. But I decided for purely personal reasons not to take the job and instead moved out to Washington, D.C. And covered politics. So I was a staff reporter at Politico. I lived in D.C. for about 4 years. I moved to Chicago and continued to do national political reporting for National Journal and News Corp and CNBC.com more recently. But I've always been interested in college sports and in the coverage of college sports and have infrequently written pieces about college sports. And so maybe about 6 years ago, I did two stories that really stuck with me. I wrote a story for Deadspin, which was a lengthy piece about Bruce Pearl, who at that point had just been recently scandalized at Tennessee. This is right when he had lost his job. And I had been interested in Bruce Pearl and had written a magazine piece about him years before. And this was sort of my second attempt at capturing his whole career in the context of the NCAA and its rules. And I wrote a fairly critical piece about him and what I viewed to be sort of his core hypocrisy from being a sort of purported whistleblower to being somebody who was then caught on the other side of the NCAA bylaws. And at the same time, I wrote a cover story for the Columbia Journalism Review that was very informative to me. And I called it the piece, The Scandal Beat. And I wrote about the sort of history of college sports reporters as investigative journalists and focused on how, really from the 80s and 90s onwards, as sports journalism departments at newspapers around the country wanted to get more journalistically serious, they started trying to break more and more scandals in college sports. And for the most part, the scandals were programs that had violated NCAA rules, athletes getting impermissible benefits, and so forth. And in that article, I talked about how I thought that this had sort of lost the plot journalistically, that at a certain point, and I'm certainly not the only one to believe this, but that the reporters were serving as former Deadspin editor Tommy Craggs put it, as the mall cops for the NCAA. We were covering institutional rules as if this was ethics or as if these were actual federal or state laws. And we needed to sort of reflect differently on why these scandals were continuing to pop up and what our role was in actually covering journalistically college sports. So that was around 2011 I wrote that piece. Really hadn't written much more on sports since the end of last year. I was writing about the presidential election for CNBC. I'm in Chicago. I felt a little bit peripheral now to the national political story just because of where I was located. And I thought, now I kind of want to do as I say. I want to take up the mission I had pointed out in that CJR piece and sort of conduct an experiment. And that experiment would be, how do I think college sports ought to be covered if it's being covered purely through the lens of public interest journalism? So I'm not constrained or confined to worry about the day-to-day ins and outs, the on-field performance of an athletics department. What if I was just going to cover it through the lights of journalism and through my own sense of ethics on the subject, not through what the NCAA determines to be improper or proper, but what, pulling myself up by my own bootstraps and thinking about what really matters if that's the frame of reference that you're going to use. And so, because I'm one person, I thought, my resources would best be used on just covering for an extended period of time one athletics department. And so, because I'm from, as I said before, New Mexico, I'm from Albuquerque, and I was a Lobo fan growing up, and that was sort of the frame of reference I had, I thought that would be an interesting college sports program to cover. So I created a little blog and thought, let me give this a run and let me see, again, I don't have a boss, I don't have an editor, I can't get deplatformed by a sports information director or by a coach. I am not in any need of access. I can just kind of do the story through my, the grit and sort of my knowledge of investigative journalism practices and see what I can discover. And so I make no bones about it. I'm not here to write flattering stories. I'm in the context of the larger coverage of this program. You have the university itself that obviously puts out all the flattering things about it. You have a local media corps that more or less writes, pretty sanctioned or flattering or affirmative stories about the athletics department and the teams thereof. I'm going to do something entirely different. I'm just going to run them through the gauntlet. I'm just going to scrutinize them on the aspects of this department that I think deserve the scrutiny, and the stories that I just didn't think anybody else was going to try to tell. And I've done that now for 10 or 11 months, and I think it's produced the kinds of stories that I expected to be produced if somebody actually was given the freedom and had the direction to cover a program this way.
So as Richard Deitsch would say, okay, there's a lot to unpack there, and there is. And let's start with the question of, to what degree has your hypothesis been proven true?
Well, on the journalistic side, I think it's been proven entirely true. I mean, since I don't claim all the credit myself, but since my website started, the University of New Mexico has forced the resignation of its then athletics director. The head basketball coach, Craig Neal, was fired. A state audit investigation has been launched. A state attorney general investigation has been launched. I have filed 2 public records lawsuits related to the athletics department that are now pending. So I think the point is that college sports doesn't necessarily fare terribly well with this kind of scrutiny. And I would extrapolate it larger to college sports. I think some of the issues are unique to the University of New Mexico. But what was particularly appealing about UNM was it's not a known factory of scandal, right? There was not an NCAA violation, or there wasn't scandal that had already been sort of baked in the cake when I arrived. This was, a department that's, for the most part, kind of an afterthought nationally, but it was pure in that way. And one of the things I'm specifically not covering and not interested in is the kind of scandal beat reporting I carped about in that CJR piece. I have almost virtually no interest in NCAA violations. I have no interest explicitly in NCAA violations that relate to payments of players or illegal contacts. I think that's moronic for journalists to become obsessed about. If the NCAA wants to worry about that, that's their prerogative. I don't think journalists have any reason ethically to be concerned about that kind of stuff. But I've been most interested in the financial component of the department. This is an athletics department that is stretched, in a university that is broke, in a state that is impoverished, and it's been trying to prop up this athletics department that's at least competitive within its conference, and is sort of showing all the signs of problems with not being able to kind of be honest with itself about what it can actually afford. I think all of that has been symptoms of some sort of core problems at the university, which I would imagine I would find in many places, or some version of that in many places, if I was to commit the same sort of attention to another athletics department.
And to date, correct me if I'm wrong, you have self-funded all the Freedom of Information Act requests, your own time, of course. There's no outside source of funding at this point, right?
Right. Now, so this was an easy decision to make, because you mentioned the business model. There is no business model in covering, and having a website dedicated to the University of New Mexico's athletics department. So, to forego the few shekels I might have been able to get from, a few click ads, it was much better for me, expecting the kind of pushback my reporting would naturally get, to not then, fuel the fire by trying to look like I was turning this into a personal profit thing. So this website is entirely, and will for always be, entirely non-revenue generating.
And that's today's One Question, brought to you by Turnkey Search, a top industry search firm since 1996. One Question is designed to give D1 Ticker subscribers valuable insights on how executive leaders in college athletics think about key issues on their respective campuses, in their departments, or within their leagues and conferences. One Question is brought to you by Turnkey Search, a top industry search firm since 1996.